They found her under the shadow of the red cliffs, where the wind goes to die. Her dress was in tatters, a story ripped from its binding. In her fist, she clutched a single long strand of hair. It was stark white, the color of bone or lightning, and it wasn't hers. The scout who found her almost missed the signs. Just a whisper of a track in the frost, a faint trail leading away from the wreckage and toward the mouth of a cave. A place the animals knew better than to enter. Inside, she was a statue carved from silence. She just sat there, nestled between the gnarled roots of the earth, her eyes like two pieces of storm-washed glass. Every night she watched the fire burn down to embers, but her gaze never wavered. They said she hadn't spoken a single word in weeks. They said her hands still trembled like a leaf in a gale whenever someone offered her a piece of bread. And they said the simple wooden locket she wore, tied around her neck with a piece of rawhide, was always warm to the touch. It gave off a strange, low hum, a vibration you could feel in your teeth if you got too close. No one knew why. And when they asked her what happened out there on the trail, she only ever whispered one thing, just once, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. They never saw it coming. No one could agree on what it was, but the proof was there, stark against the landscape. The remains of a wagon, its spokes burned to charcoal, the iron of its wheels twisted into impossible shapes, as if heated by a forge hotter than the sun itself, and snagged high in the branches of a pine tree, a child's bonnet, untouched by the flames. But the strangest part? There were no footprints leading away from the disaster. None at all. Except for hers. If you think you know where this is going, you're wrong. The truth is darker than any cave and more twisted than any burned piece of iron. Stick with me, because what happened in the town of Broken Trace will change the way you think about silence. It all started long before the fire. The town of Broken Trace sat in the crook of the hills, like something the world had tried to forget. Dust wasn't just on the ground, it was an ingredient in the air you breathed. Shutters banged on their hinges, even on the calmest days, like they were applauding a ghost. Nothing in this town grew quickly, not the trees, not trust, and certainly not forgiveness. Through this forgotten place, she walked, always before dawn, before the saloon windows started to bleed their yellow light onto the street, before the first ring of the blacksmith's hammer, before anyone had a good reason to stare. They called her Clara, but rarely to her face. The name was a currency traded in murmurs and sidelong glances. Clara, the quiet. Clara, the widow. Clara with the silver streak. That last one was for the slash of white hair that fell above her right ear, a stark contrast to the coal-black braid she wore. Some of the old-timers said it appeared the very night her husband, Eli, was lost with the wagon train. Others swore it had always been there, a mark of her nature, a brand that singled her out, just like the slight limp in her step. It was part of her shape, part of her curse. Clara never bothered to correct them. Let them guess. Their stories were simpler than the truth. Her cabin was perched at the very edge of the trail, right near a jagged stone outcrop the locals called Widow's Spine. No one ever came to visit. Not the circuit preacher, not a lost traveler, nobody. Her curtains were always drawn, but a single lantern always burned low, a pinprick of light against an ocean of darkness. If you were brave enough to ride past her property at night, you might catch her silhouette in the window, just standing there, still as the mountain itself. The general store would leave a ration box for her near the back door. She'd slip in like a shadow, leave her coins on the crate, give a single, sharp nod, and be gone before her name could even settle in the dusty air. The space she left behind would instantly fill with rumors. Her husband was a card cheat, got what was coming to him. No, I heard he took his own life out on that trail. Shame drove her out here. The old woman at the laundry says she speaks to the dead. She doesn't speak at all. That last one was the closest to the truth. Clara had spoken once. She'd tried to tell them what she saw right after the massacre, but the sound of her own voice, raw and broken, had cracked something deep inside her. After that, silence felt safer. It felt like armor. They didn't know the real secrets she held. They didn't know that the sound in her left ear was mostly a dull ringing, a souvenir from the fire, or that her hip, crushed in the chaos, ached with a fury that foretold every coming storm. They didn't know that sometimes, in the dead of night, she would put on her husband's old canvas coat just to feel the weight of him around her shoulders one last time. No one asked, and Clara had long ago stopped wishing they would. It hadn't always been this way. She had come west on that very same wagon train, her eyes bright with hope, a smile on her face. Her husband, Eli, had a nickname for her. He called her his sunrise. He said she lit up every room she entered, that she had a shine that nothing in this world could ever tarnish. But the sun is a violent thing when it sets. After the fire, after the blood, after a sound that wasn't quite a scream and not quite a roar echoed through the canyon, she came back to Broken Trace, alone. There were no bodies to bury, just ash, and a single scorched wedding ring she'd found in the dirt. She kept it tucked in a handkerchief, but even that was lost, washed away in a flash flood a year later. She stayed, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of grief, or maybe, just maybe, because the land where everything ended was the only place that felt real anymore. The town had made space for her, but they had never made room. Sometimes she would walk past the small schoolhouse and listen to the children reciting their letters, their innocent laughter spilling over the fence like a song from another world. One afternoon, a little girl with bright red ribbons in her hair waved at her through the window. For the first time in years, Clara felt the corner of her mouth twitch into something that resembled a smile. The very next day, the teacher nailed the curtains shut over that window. Only the wild things seemed to understand her. A sly red fox would sometimes leave a freshly caught rabbit on her porch. A hawk built its nest in the crumbling brick of her chimney. The silence they shared was a language all its own. She worked with her hands, mending torn saddles for pennies, sharpening axe heads, scraping hides, quiet work for a quiet life. But her eyes, those storm-gray eyes sunken with memory, told a different story. They were the eyes of a woman who was still watching the horizon, waiting for something she couldn't name. There were days the town forgot she existed. Then there were days they remembered with a vengeance. A stare held a second too long, a whisper that was a little too loud. She didn't even scream, they'd say, just stood there and watched it all burn. Maybe she was part of it. Maybe she's the reason it happened. Nothing just burns like that. No one survives that sort of thing. And in a dark, secret corner of her heart, Clara agreed with them. Because the woman she used to be, the one who laughed with her whole body, the one who danced barefoot in the summer rain, the one who read poetry aloud by lantern light, that Clara had died in the fire. What was left was something else entirely, quieter, sharper, hungrier, still listening for footsteps that never came back. Then one morning, everything changed. She stepped outside her cabin, the cold air sharp in her lungs, and she saw them, tracks, pressed into the morning frost. They were small, almost weightless, not hers, not made by anyone from town. They were the tracks of bare feet, a child, leading from the deep woods right up to her porch, and then vanishing as if the person who made them had simply been plucked into the sky. Clara stared at them for a long, long time, her heart a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. She didn't follow them. Not yet. Instead, she turned and whispered to the cold, empty air, a voice unused to its own sound. Something's coming. It was a Tuesday when the wind changed. It wasn't a change in direction or in force. It was a change in feeling. The air itself seemed to be holding its breath, listening for something it wasn't supposed to hear. The town of Broken Trace, of course, paid it no mind. A few tumbleweeds cartwheeled down Main Street. The blacksmith let out a string of curses over a cracked horseshoe. The undertaker, a man who always seemed pleased with the world, was sweeping dust from his front step. Everything was painfully, unnervingly ordinary, but Clara felt it. She always did. Her bones were a barometer for things the sky hadn't yet said aloud. She was on her way back from the creek, her basket filled with smooth, gray stones she used to line her fireplace, when she saw him. He was standing at the split-rail fence that marked the edge of her property. He wasn't from town. That was the first thing she knew for certain. His clothes weren't caked with the fine red dust of Broken Trace. His boots, though well worn, had the ghost of a polish to them. A broad-brimmed hat was tilted low, casting his face in a deep shadow, but it was the way he stood that set her teeth on edge. Perfectly still, unbothered by the biting wind, his posture that of a man who was used to watching and waiting. Clara froze halfway to her porch. For a full minute, they just stared at each other across that strip of dead, winter grass. The silence was a physical thing, a wall between them. "Ma'am," he said finally. His voice was soft, but with a gravelly edge, like stones tumbling in a slow river. "I was told you do repairs?" Her first instinct, the one that had kept her safe for years, was to turn, to melt back into the shadows of her cabin and bolt the door. But something in his voice held her rooted to the spot. There was no demand in it, no threat, just a strange, unnerving stillness. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Maybe. He took a slow step forward, then another, moving as if he understood she was a wild thing that might bolt at any sudden movement. "I have a saddle strap, torn clean through. My mule's tied up just down the hill." He didn't gesture, didn't try to bargain. "I'll pay fair." Clara hesitated for a heartbeat, then gave another sharp nod and gestured with her chin toward the worn bench under the overhang of her porch. An invitation. He didn't speak while she worked. He just leaned his back against a wooden post, his arms folded across his chest. His eyes, hidden in the shadow of his hat, followed the quick, efficient movements of her fingers as she threaded sinew through the thick leather. He smelled of pine smoke and ash, but not the sour, stale smell of the town's chimneys. This was an older scent, a campfire smell. After a long while, he broke the silence again. Not with a question about her, but with an observation. "Saw a strange storm brewing up over Red Hollow on my way in," he said, his voice still low. The wind was moving backward, like it was chasing itself. Clara didn't look up, but her hands paused for a fraction of a second. "I've seen things twist like that before," he added, his voice dropping even lower. "Always ends one of two ways, fire or flood." She still didn't speak, but something in her posture softened. The rigid line of her shoulders eased. Her breathing, which had been tight and shallow, deepened. When she finished the repair, she handed the strap back to him without a word. He took it from her, his fingers brushing against hers. It was just a graze, a fleeting touch, but it sent a spark up her arm, not of warmth, but of something else, a jolt of memory, or maybe a warning. She snatched her hand back as if she'd been burned. "How much?" he asked. She held up 2 fingers. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver dollar, placing it firmly in her palm. It was far too much. "Name's Silas," he said, finally tipping his hat back just enough for her to see his eyes. They were a pale, clear gray, like a winter sky, and they were watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Didn't catch yours." She didn't offer it. He waited a moment longer, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. Then he turned and walked away, his boots crunching on the frosted ground. She watched him until he disappeared over the rise of the hill. The silence he left behind was different. It was heavier now, thicker, as if something had stepped into her world that had no intention of leaving quietly. By noon the next day, the whispers had already found her. Clara didn't need to go into town to hear them. She felt them on the wind. Stranger came through the Salt Horn Saloon, asking questions. Too polite, that one. Asked about the widow. Sheriff's got his eye on him. Thinks he's a Pinkerton, maybe a bounty man. You don't trust a man who drinks only water and watches the door. The preacher, a man with eyes like hot coals, had apparently told his small congregation that the stranger had been asking about the old wagon trails, the ones that hadn't been used in years, the ones that led straight to the site of the massacre. Clara tried to ignore it. It was just town gossip, the fuel that kept Broken Trace running. But she couldn't ignore the feeling he'd left behind, a feeling of being seen, truly seen. Silas came back 3 days later. This time, he had a broken stirrup. And another story. Coyotes got bold last night, he said, not looking at her, but glancing up toward the jagged ridge of Widow's spine. Sounded like they were calling something down from the mountain. He finally met her eyes. Figured you might know this land better than most. She didn't answer him, but this time she gestured him inside. While the iron of her small stove heated up for the repair, she poured him a cup of hot, bitter tea. Neither of them smiled. It wasn't necessary. As the wind howled outside, rattling the single pane of glass in her window, he tilted his head, listening. "You ever hear something in the wind that ain't wind?" he asked softly. Clara looked up at him then. It was just for a second, but it was enough. He saw the answer in her eyes, the haunted, knowing look of someone who had heard that sound before. They didn't talk much, not with words, but a strange understanding began to weave itself between them, a thread of shared silence. He never asked about the silver streak in her hair. He never stared at the way she instinctively turned her right ear toward him to hear better. He never mentioned her limp, even when a rainstorm made it so bad she could barely walk. And she never asked him why he always sat with his back to a solid wall, or why his eyes were constantly sweeping the tree line, cataloging every shadow, every moving branch. They didn't need to. Some people aren't drawn together by what they say. They're drawn together by the secrets they keep. The town noticed. Of course they noticed. That stranger's been up to the widow's cabin 3 times now. A quiet man and a quiet woman. They're sharing more than tea, I reckon. There's a storm coming, old Amos, a man who rarely spoke, muttered outside the church. I can feel it in my teeth. They say ghosts travel in 2s. No one answered him. They just moved away, as if his words were contagious. Late one night, Clara was banking the fire when she heard a sound, a scratching at the edge of her porch. She grabbed the heavy iron poker and stood motionless in the dark, listening. When she was sure the sound was gone, she cracked open the door. There, in the faint moonlight, were the footprints again. Small, barefoot. But this time, they weren't just at her porch. They were pointed the wrong way, as if someone had been standing there, pressed against the wall of her cabin, listening, and then had simply vanished back into the trees. She didn't sleep that night. She just sat in her chair by the window, her lantern turned down low, watching the impenetrable darkness of the woods. Silas returned the next morning. He didn't knock. He didn't have to. He just appeared at her door, his face grim. "Someone's following me," he said, his voice flat and hard. "Been circling my camp at night, leaving signs." He looked past her, into the dark corners of her cabin. "I thought you should know." Clara didn't react. She didn't gasp. She just moved to the stove, added another piece of wood to the fire and put the kettle on, because she already knew. And she was starting to suspect they weren't being followed by a person. They were being hunted by a memory. The thaw came late that year, clinging to the shadows like a stubborn ghost. April arrived, but snow still choked the high passes, and the wind clawed at the windows of Clara's cabin like a starved animal. She stayed inside more and more. An unspoken routine had settled between her and Silas. He had stopped asking his strange, probing questions, and she had started leaving her door unlatched when the sky began to darken. It was an invitation written in silence. But peace, in a town like Broken Trace, is just the quiet moment before the screaming starts. It began subtly. She returned from gathering firewood one afternoon to find the shutter on her front window, which had been broken for years, nailed firmly shut. Not repaired. Sealed. A few days later, a word was scratched deep into her fence post. A single jagged word carved with the tip of a knife. Leave. Then came the sheriff. He rode up to her cabin at dusk, his horse kicking up dust that glittered like blood in the setting sun. He didn't dismount. He just sat there on his horse, a looming silhouette, his eyes cold and flat beneath the brim of his hat. Clara stood in her doorway, her arms crossed, her jaw set like stone. "We've had some complaints, Clara," he said, his voice a low drawl that didn't match the hardness in his eyes. "Folks are saying you've been seen in places you don't belong." She didn't answer. She just stared back at him, her silence a challenge. "You and that drifter," he added, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near her steps. "He's stirring things up, asking about bad history that folks round here want left buried." He leaned forward in his saddle. "Some things are better left lost." Still, she said nothing. Her silence was a wall he couldn't seem to breach. With a sigh of frustration, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and dropped it into the dirt at her feet. "Warrant for questioning," he grunted. "Down at my office, tomorrow morning. You're not under arrest." He paused, letting the last word hang in the air. "Yet." Then he wheeled his horse around and rode away, leaving her alone in the deepening cold. Clara never bent down to pick up the paper. She just watched the wind take it, tumbling it away into the sagebrush. 2 days later, the general store refused to fill her ration order. The girl behind the counter, a young woman with red cheeks and kind eyes, suddenly couldn't seem to meet Clara's gaze. Ma says I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. Clara stared at her for a long moment, then turned and walked out, her basket empty, her dignity intact. That night, a rock shattered her window. It wasn't just a rock. It was a message. There was no note tied to it, no name shouted in the night. Just the splintering crash of glass, the sudden rush of cold wind, and a long, echoing silence that followed. Something inside Clara didn't just crack. It broke. She left before the sun was even a rumor in the east. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't have a plan. She just grabbed her husband's old coat, shoved her feet into her worn boots, and took a small bundle of flint and steel. She walked west, away from the town, away from the whispers and the hate. She walked into the deep woods, where the old, forgotten trail curved up toward Widow's Spine. The frost bit through the thin soles of her boots, but she didn't feel it. She didn't feel anything except a cold, hollow emptiness. The snow got deeper as she climbed. She slipped once, her bad hip screaming in protest. Then she slipped again, her breath coming in thin white clouds, each one a ghost of a word she could no longer speak. Near the bend in the trail, her legs finally gave out. She collapsed, her knees folding beneath her as if her strings had been cut. The ground was hard and cold and unforgiving. It felt like an embrace. For a long time, she just lay there, the snow melting against her feverish skin, staring up at the blank, gray canvas of the sky. The ache in her chest, the one she had carried for years, was blooming now, a fire spreading beneath her ribs. She thought of the wagon train. She thought of the shouting, the confusion, the unnatural light that had devoured everything. She thought of Eli's voice calling her name in the dark. She thought about how she had never screamed, not once. And now, lying freezing in the snow, she couldn't even remember why. The sound of footsteps came later, heavy, steady, crunching through the snow. She didn't look up. She didn't have the strength. She just closed her eyes, waiting. A heavy coat dropped over her shoulders. It smelled of pine smoke and ash. There was no fanfare, no name spoken, just the sudden gift of warmth. And then his voice, low and steady, right beside her ear. "You don't have to go much farther to disappear," Silas said. "You already did that years ago. I just followed the echo." He didn't try to lift her. He didn't try to touch her. He just sat down in the snow beside her, their shoulders brushing, sharing his warmth. They sat like that for a long, long time. A silent man and a silent woman, two ghosts on a frozen mountain, until the wind finally calmed and the biting cold seemed to retreat. "You knew they'd turn on you," he said. It wasn't a question. She managed a slight nod, the movement sending a jolt of pain through her stiff neck. "They're not afraid of you, Clara," he said softly. "They're afraid of what you survived. They're afraid of what you represent." He paused, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy outline of the town below. "But I think they're really afraid of something much, much bigger than you." Finally, she spoke. Her voice was a dry, hoarse whisper, like bark splitting in a deep freeze. "They think I brought it back with me." He didn't ask her what it was. He didn't have to. He just looked at her, his pale gray eyes holding a startling depth of understanding. "Then we face it together," he said. They didn't go back to her cabin. Not right away. Instead, they made a small, hidden camp in a narrow canyon, shielded from the wind and prying eyes. He built the fire, his movements economical and sure. She made tea from the herbs she carried in her pockets. He watched the trees, and she listened to the wind. When she woke the next morning, curled in his coat by the embers of the fire, he was already awake. He was carving a piece of wood with a small, sharp knife. He wasn't carving a shape she recognized, like an animal or a face. He was carving lines, patterns, spirals and stars and strange, jagged marks that looked like river bends seen from above. She watched him until he finally noticed her gaze. "What?" he asked, his hands stilling. Clara just tilted her head, a question in her eyes. He seemed to understand. "I had a brother," he said, his voice quiet. "Lost him out on the divide, a long time ago. I started carving to remember his face." He looked down at the strange symbols etched into the wood. "Now I carve to remember who I am." Clara reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and brushed them against the wood. She traced one of the spiral patterns, a slow, deliberate movement. Then she looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, and whispered the truest thing she had said in years. "I forgot how to remember." He didn't tell her it wasn't true. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just took another smooth piece of cedar from his pack, placed it gently in her hand along with his knife, and let her start carving her own lines. They all thought she was broken beyond repair, a discarded remnant of a tragedy. But he looked at the ashes and saw an ember still glowing. The fire didn't roar back to life all at once. It started small, a breath of warmth in a place where only cold had settled, a single, stubborn ember refusing to be extinguished. They returned to her cabin under the cover of darkness. Silas brought down cedar logs from the high ridge, their scent filling the small space with the smell of the deep woods. Clara, moving with a newfound purpose, unearthed an old hammer and a rusted coffee can full of bent nails from the dirt-floored shed behind her cabin. They worked without speaking, their hands busy with tasks that felt solid and real. Patching the hole in the roof, resetting the stones of the hearth, replacing the shattered window pane with a piece of oiled canvas. They were laying kindling for something neither of them dared to name yet. A life. Every night, they sat by the fire, the smoke curling up into the vast, indifferent sky. And every night, Clara found herself waiting for the wind to shift again, waiting for the torch-wielding mob from town to appear on the ridge. waiting for the past to reach out and drag them both back into the darkness. But the town didn't come with torches. It came with something far more chilling. Silence. No one spoke her name anymore. No one's gaze lingered on her cabin from afar. The sheriff didn't ride out again. The ration box at the general store disappeared for good. It was as if she had finally succeeded in becoming a ghost, as if she had been erased from the town's memory. And maybe she had been. Maybe the Clara they all whispered about. The haunted survivor, the woman who never screamed, the one who walked alone and never asked for an ounce of kindness. Maybe that woman was finally gone. And maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. But just when she started to believe the past had finally loosened its death grip, the wind carried something new. Not a warning this time. A return. Silas saw them first. He was sitting on the porch step nursing a cup of coffee when he set his mug down with a quiet, deliberate thud. His whole body went rigid. "Company," he said, his voice a low growl. Clara looked up from the harness she was mending. 2 riders were moving slowly up the trail toward her cabin. Their coats were heavy with the dust of long travel. They weren't from Broken Trace. They weren't from anywhere nearby. Her hands tightened around the heavy leather awl until her knuckles turned white. Silas stood up, stretching slowly, a predator uncoiling. "I'll meet them," he said. Clara said nothing. She just stood up and moved to stand beside him, because some ghosts need 2 people to put them in the ground. The riders stopped at the broken-down fence line. The older one, a man with gray streaks at his temples and weary lines around his eyes, looked Silas up and down. "You got a name?" "I got a couple," Silas replied, his voice deceptively calm. "But neither one's for you to use." The younger man, who had a cruel twist to his mouth and restless, shifting eyes, let out a short, humorless laugh. "The Pinkerton office said you'd be a hard one." Clara saw it then, a flicker in Silas's jaw, the barest tightening of a muscle, a ghost of something old and dangerous locked away behind his calm facade. The gray-haired man's gaze shifted to her. "You're the widow," he stated. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer. She just held his gaze. He nodded slowly, as if he understood something no one had said aloud. "We heard what happened to that wagon train years back." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Heard you lost everything." Clara's hands curled into fists at her sides. The awl felt heavy and solid in her palm. The younger man leaned forward on his saddle horn, his eyes glinting with a cold, predatory light. "Funny thing, though, we also heard there was cargo, valuable cargo. Some folks say the wrong person survived that night." Silas shifted his weight then, just a half step forward. It was a subtle movement, almost unnoticeable. He wasn't trying to be a shield. He was a signal, a warning. Clara didn't need his protection, but the simple fact that he was there, a solid presence beside her, sent a tremor of warmth through her. She wasn't alone. The older man let out a long, tired sigh. "Look, we don't want trouble. We're just looking for answers. We just need to know what you saw." Clara met his eyes, her own gaze as cold and steady as a frozen river, and for the first time in a long, long time, she used her voice as a weapon. "I saw fire," she said, each word sharp and clear. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind died down. The birds stopped singing. For a moment, the whole world seemed to be listening. The older man finally broke the spell. He pulled on his reins, gave a curt, respectful tip of his hat, and started to turn his horse. But the younger one lingered. He stared at Clara, his eyes dark with a familiar kind of poison. The kind of look you see on a man who doesn't believe in ghosts, but enjoys hunting them anyway. "Fire doesn't burn by itself, ma'am," he said, his voice slick with menace. "And it always, always comes back for what it missed." Then he spurred his horse and followed his partner down the trail, leaving a cloud of dust and unspoken threats hanging in the air. Clara watched them go, her heart hammering against her ribs. Silas finally let out a breath he seemed to have been holding. "Old history," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "It ain't done with me yet." Clara turned and looked at him then. Really looked at him. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of the secrets he carried. "You leaving?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. He didn't answer right away. He just stared out at the dust swirling on the horizon, at the way the past never really faded. It just settled, waiting for the next wind to pick it up again. Then he turned and met her gaze, and the faintest hint of a smile touched his lips. "Not unless you are," he said. That night, they built a second fire outside the cabin. It wasn't for warmth. It wasn't for light. It was for something else entirely. From the bottom of an old dusty trunk, Clara pulled out a small folded bundle of yellowed linen, her wedding veil. She hadn't touched it in years, hadn't allowed herself to. With a steady hand, she walked to the fire and gently placed it on the flames. She watched it curl, blacken, and turn to ash, disappearing into the night sky. A wisp of smoke, and then nothing. Silas stood beside her, watching with her, saying nothing at all. Some ghosts don't need a grave, they just need to be let go. The town waited. They waited for the drifter to leave. They waited for the widow to break. They waited for the story to end the way they all expected it to, in ruin. But some stories don't follow the map. Some stories bloom in the places where only silence used to live. Spring finally came to Broken Trace. It came hesitantly at first, then all at once, a flood of green and gold washing over the sullen brown landscape. The snow melted with a sigh, leaving behind pools of memory, muddy and quiet, as if the past itself was finally learning to rest. The sky seemed higher, the air softer. And in that fragile space between the thaw and the bloom, Clara found herself standing at the edge of the town. She hadn't set foot on its dusty main street in months, not since the night the rock had shattered her window and her world. But this morning, she wore boots that were clean of mud, her shoulders were squared, and the hem of her coat brushed against the new shoots of wild sage. Silas walked beside her. He didn't hold her hand. He didn't have to. His presence was enough. The town felt smaller now, or maybe she was bigger. Old men who used to spit when she passed now just stared from their porches. Women who used to whisper behind their hands now busied themselves, pretending not to see her. Children watched, their faces pressed like pale flowers against the glass of their windows. No one spoke her name, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't a wall, it was a space she was finally claiming as her own. They stopped in front of the general store. Clara paused, her hand on the door. She remembered the girl behind the counter, the freckled face, the kind eyes that had been clouded by fear and whispers. She took a deep breath and stepped through the door, the little bell above it announcing her arrival like a proclamation. The air inside smelled of tobacco, yeast, and old secrets. The girl looked up from stocking a shelf, and her eyes widened. She froze. Then Silas stepped forward, moving past Clara, and placed 2 silver coins on the worn wooden counter. They landed with a sharp, definitive clink. "1 hammer," he said, his voice calm and clear, "a bag of 3-penny nails, and a spool of blue thread." The girl's gaze darted from Silas's steady eyes to Clara's unreadable face. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She simply waited. Finally, with a small, hesitant nod, the girl turned. She gathered the items, her movements quick and nervous, and placed them in a cloth bag. As she handed it to Clara, their eyes met, just for a second. And in the girl's eyes, Clara saw something new, not pity, not fear, just recognition. Outside, in the bright spring sunshine, Silas looked at her with a faint smile playing on his lips. "That was your final test," he said quietly. Clara raised an eyebrow. "Did I pass?" He reached out and, for the first time, took her hand. His grip was warm and strong. "No," he said. "You rewrote the test." But their story was far from over. The quiet life they were building was resting on a foundation of lies, not their lies, but lies that were about to be unearthed. The Pinkertons hadn't left. They had just retreated into the hills, watching, waiting, and they weren't the only ones. The barefoot tracks appeared again, this time closer, and the locket around Clara's neck began to hum with a new urgency, its warmth turning into a burning heat against her skin. They hadn't found peace. They had just found the eye of the storm. The quiet life they started to build was a fragile thing, constructed from salvaged boards and shared silence. They didn't leave Broken Trace right away. Instead, they began to carve out a space that was theirs alone, a small island in a sea of judgment. They cleared the land behind the cabin, the rhythmic thud of Silas's axe a steady heartbeat against the silence. Clara, her hands that had once only mended things for others, now planted seeds in the dark, rich earth. Tiny seeds of corn and squash and beans, seeds of a future she hadn't dared to imagine. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the clouds in shades of orange and violet, Silas was repairing the porch. He was hammering a nail when he suddenly stopped, his head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. "They're still out there," he said, his voice low. Clara, who was washing tin plates in a bucket of water, didn't need to ask who they were. The two riders, the so-called Pinkertons. "They're not watching the town," Silas continued, his eyes scanning the darkening line of trees that bordered their property. "They're watching us. Or watching you." A cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, trickled down Clara's spine. She dried her hands and came to stand beside him, her gaze following his to the woods. The trees stood like silent, waiting sentinels. "Why?" she whispered, the word barely disturbing the air. Silas turned to her, his face grim in the twilight. "I don't think they're Pinkertons, Clara. I think they're something else. And I don't think they're interested in the men who died on that wagon train." He looked down at the simple wooden locket that still hung around her neck. "I think they're interested in what survived." Suddenly the locket, which had been humming a low, steady tune for weeks, pulsed with a sudden, intense heat. It grew so hot against her skin that she gasped, her hand flying to her chest. It felt like a hot coal against her flesh. And at that exact moment, a sound echoed from the deep woods, a high, thin cry. Not an animal, a child. Before Silas could react, Clara was moving. The limp that usually plagued her was gone, replaced by a desperate, fluid grace. She ran from the cabin, not toward the town, but directly toward the dark, waiting trees, toward the source of the cry. "Clara, wait!" Silas yelled, grabbing a lantern and racing after her. He followed her crashing sounds through the undergrowth, the beam of his lantern bouncing wildly through the darkness. He found her in a small, hidden clearing, a place so well concealed by tangled briars and fallen logs that you could walk right past it a dozen times and never know it was there. In the center of the clearing was a crude shelter, woven from branches and mud, and kneeling in front of it was Clara. But she wasn't alone. In her arms, she held a small, thin girl, no older than 8 or 9. The child was covered in dirt and dressed in rags, her eyes wide with a terror that went beyond words. She was silent, not making a sound, just clinging to Clara as if she were the only solid thing in a world made of smoke. And streaming down from her temple, through a tangled mess of dirt-brown hair, was a single, stark white streak. The exact same color as the strand of hair Clara had been clutching when they found her near the cave. Silas stopped dead in his tracks, the lantern light illuminating the scene, the barefoot prints, the child's bonnet in the tree, the constant watchful gaze Clara kept on the woods. It all clicked into place with a horrifying, resounding clarity. "You knew," Silas breathed, his voice filled with a stunned disbelief. "This whole time, you knew." Clara looked up at him, her face a mask of fierce, protective love. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her actions spoke louder than any words ever could. She hadn't been the only survivor. She had been a guardian. The child whimpered, burying her face in Clara's shoulder. As she did, the locket around Clara's neck pulsed again, its light glowing faintly through the wood. The child flinched, not in pain, but as if in response. Silas took a hesitant step forward. "Who is she?" Clara finally found her voice, a fierce, protective whisper. "Her name is Sarah. Her parents were on the wagon train. And you've been hiding her, all this time?" The sheer audacity of it, the strength it must have taken, was staggering. To live as an outcast, bearing the town's hatred and suspicion, all while secretly caring for a lost child in the wilderness. "They would have taken her," Clara said, her voice hard. "Or worse." "Who would have?" Silas pressed, his mind racing. "The town? The sheriff?" Before Clara could answer, the younger of the two riders stepped out from the trees at the edge of the clearing. He was holding a pistol, its long barrel gleaming in the lantern light. The cruel smile was back on his face. "We would have," he said, his voice casual, as if he were discussing the weather. "The girl has something that belongs to our employer." The older rider appeared behind him, his face etched with reluctance. "Just give us the girl, son," he said to Silas. "No one needs to get hurt." But the younger man's eyes weren't on Silas. They were fixed on the locket, which was now glowing with a steady, insistent light. "That's the container," the young man hissed, his eyes wide with a greedy, feverish light. "The source is inside. Hand it over, widow. And the girl. Now." Silas moved, placing himself between the men and Clara and the child. "You'll have to go through me." The young man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "That can be arranged." But as he raised his pistol, a new sound cut through the night, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from all directions at once. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate, a deep, resonant hum that matched the pulsing of the locket. The trees began to sway, though there was no wind. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with a strange, electric energy. The older rider's face went pale. "It's starting," he whispered, taking a step back. "I told you we shouldn't have pushed them." The younger man ignored him, his eyes still locked on Clara. "Whatever tricks you have, old woman, they won't work." Clara clutched the child tighter and looked at Silas, her eyes wide with a terror he now understood. This was it, the thing from the massacre, the fire that wasn't fire, the reason for her silence. It hadn't just been a memory she was hiding from. It was a power she had been trying to control, and it was about to be unleashed. The ground vibrated with a terrifying intensity. The low hum escalated into a deep, resonant tone that made the teeth ache and the bones buzz. The air itself grew thick, shimmering like a heat haze on a summer road. The lantern in Silas's hand flickered and died, plunging the clearing into a disorienting gloom, lit only by the eerie, pulsating glow from the locket around Clara's neck. "What is this witchcraft?" the younger rider snarled, but his voice was tight with a fear that betrayed his bravado. He took a step forward, his pistol still aimed at Clara. "Don't be a fool, Marcus!" the older man, Jed, shouted, grabbing his partner's arm. "We have to get out of here. Now!" Marcus shook him off, his eyes wild with greed. "Not without the source! The boss wants it!" "The boss isn't here!" Jed shot back, his face a mask of pure terror as he stared into the swirling darkness. "And he won't be able to pay you if you're a pile of dust!" Silas didn't hesitate. He wasn't a fighter by trade. He was a watcher, a seeker, but in that moment, instinct took over. He lunged, not at Marcus, but at the lantern, grabbing it from the ground and smashing it against a rock. In a flash of inspiration, he ripped a strip of cloth from his own shirt, dipped it in the spilled oil, and lit it with the flint and steel from his pocket. A makeshift torch. The flame sputtered to life, casting flickering, monstrous shadows across the clearing. And in that light, Silas finally saw what Clara had been hiding from. It wasn't a monster. It was an absence. Where Marcus was advancing, the very air seemed to be unraveling. The leaves on the ground weren't burning. They were simply ceasing to be, fading into nothingness. A patch of ground near Marcus's boot turned from brown soil to a gray, featureless slate. It was a silent, creeping void, a hunger that consumed light, sound, and matter itself. And it was drawn to one thing, the violent, greedy intent pouring off Marcus like a stench. "Clara!" Silas yelled over the deafening hum. "The locket! What is it?" Clara, her face pale but her eyes blazing with resolve, finally broke her long silence. Her voice, when it came, was not the whisper of a victim, but the clear, ringing command of a survivor. "It's not a weapon. It's a key. It doesn't create. It unlocks." The child, Sarah, was staring at the advancing void, her eyes wide not with terror, but with a strange, solemn understanding. She reached out a small, trembling hand and placed it over the locket on Clara's chest. The moment she touched it, the humming stopped. The vibrating ground went still. The light from the locket intensified into a brilliant, blinding beam that shot straight up into the sky. Marcus screamed as the void, its focus now absolute, surged toward him. It wasn't a fast attack. It was a slow, inexorable consumption. He fired his pistol wildly, the bullets vanishing without a sound a foot from his barrel. He tried to turn and run, but his feet had become part of the gray, featureless ground. He was anchored to his own destruction. He dissolved, not into ash, not into smoke. He just faded. His clothes, his gun, his screaming face, all became less and less real, until they were just a translucent memory against the trees. And then they were gone. Jed stood frozen for a heartbeat, his mouth agape in horror. Then he turned and scrambled away into the darkness, the sound of his panicked flight swallowed by the sudden, profound silence. The beam of light from the locket faded, and the clearing was returned to the simple, quiet dark of the forest. The only light was the flickering flame of Silas's torch. Silas stared at the spot where Marcus had been. There was nothing there. Not a scorch mark, not a footprint, just undisturbed forest floor, as if Marcus had never existed at all. He turned to look at Clara and Sarah. The child had her eyes closed, her hand still resting on the locket, her breathing slow and even. Clara was looking at him, tears streaming silently down her face. They weren't tears of fear or sadness. They were tears of release. "My husband. The others on the train," she said, her voice catching. "They found one, a stone, like the one in the locket, but bigger. They fought over it, drew knives, guns, their greed, their violence. It fed the stone. It woke it up." She shuddered, a deep, full-body tremor. "It didn't burn them. It erased them." "And you?" Silas asked, his voice barely a whisper. "And Sarah? Why did it spare you?" "We didn't want it," Clara said simply. "I tried to stop them. Sarah's mother hid her in the wagon. We were innocent. The hunger had no taste for us." Silas finally understood. The town's fear, the sheriff's threats. They weren't just afraid of Clara. They were terrified of the power she unknowingly carried, a power that judged not the silent or the strange, but the greedy and the violent. "The barefoot prints," he said, the pieces falling into place. "Sarah has been coming to you. She can feel it, can't she? The energy from the locket." Clara nodded, stroking the child's hair. She can calm it, and she can call it. We are connected to it. We are its keepers. From the direction of the town, a new sound began to rise. Shouting, the barking of dogs, and the telltale glow of multiple torches bobbing through the trees. The sheriff, and he wasn't coming for a conversation. He had heard the unnatural silence, seen the beam of light, and his deepest fears had been realized. Clara looked at Silas, her eyes filled not with fear, but with a weary resignation. "It's not over," she said. "The town has its own secrets and its own hunger." The torchlight grew closer, a swarm of angry fireflies converging on their location. The shouting resolved into distinct voices, fueled by fear and whiskey. Leading the charge was the sheriff, his face a pale, grim mask in the flickering light. Beside him, with a burning cross held aloft, was the town's preacher, his eyes rolling with a fanatic's fire. "It is the demon! The witch of the woods!" the preacher shrieked, his voice cracking with hysteria. "She has called her master forth! We must cleanse this ground with fire!" The small mob of townsfolk behind them murmured in agreement, their faces a mixture of terror and self-righteous fury. They were a tidal wave of ignorance, ready to wash away anything they didn't understand. "Clara, take the girl and run," Silas said, stepping in front of them, his makeshift torch the only thing holding back the encroaching darkness. "No," Clara said, her voice firm. She stood up, pulling the sleeping child gently into her arms. No more running. Tonight, they face the truth. The sheriff and his mob burst into the clearing, their torches casting a hellish, dancing light on the scene. They stopped short when they saw Silas standing there, defiant, and Clara behind him, holding a child they had never seen before. "What in God's name?" the sheriff breathed, his eyes wide. "It's a familiar," the preacher screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Sarah. "A creature in the shape of a child to fool us. Don't look upon it." "Shut up, you old fool," Silas snarled. "This is a child Clara has been protecting from men like you." The sheriff ignored him, his gaze locked on Clara. "You did this," he accused, his voice shaking. "The light, the silence. You've brought the curse back, haven't you? After all these years, you brought it back." "There is no curse," Clara said, her voice ringing with a newfound power that silenced the muttering crowd. "There is only a mirror, and it only shows you what you already are." "Lies! The lies of a witch!" the preacher shrieked. "Is it a lie, Sheriff?" Clara challenged, taking a step forward. Sarah stirred in her arms but didn't wake. "Is it a lie that the founders of this town made a deal? That this valley was given to them in exchange for a promise?" The sheriff's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Clara pressed, her voice cutting through the night. "A promise to look the other way, to let the trail break, to let the hunger feed on anyone who passed through carrying greed in their hearts. Also, your town could have its quiet prosperity, so you could be a big man in a small, cursed pond." A gasp went through the crowd. A few of the older men in the mob looked at the sheriff, a dawning horror on their faces. They remembered the stories, the travelers who vanished without a trace, the wagons found empty, broken trace. It wasn't just a name, it was a description of its function. "She's lying!" the sheriff roared, his composure finally shattering. He raised his shotgun, aiming it squarely at Clara. "She's the monster! She's the one who survived when all those good people died." "They weren't good people," Clara's voice boomed, filled with the pain of years of silence. "They were thieves and killers, fighting over a rock they didn't understand. I survived because I was not like them. This child survived because she is pure. The hunger you fear, Sheriff, it has no taste for the innocent." She looked down at the locket, then back at him, her eyes filled with a terrible, righteous fire. "But you," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. You who have sacrificed countless souls on the altar of your own comfort and power, you must look delicious. As if on cue, Sarah's eyes fluttered open. She wasn't looking at the sheriff or the mob. She was looking at the locket. She reached out her small hand and once again placed it on the wooden surface, but this time she didn't just touch it. She squeezed. The void returned. It didn't erupt. It simply was. A sphere of perfect, silent, consuming nothingness materialized directly in front of the sheriff. It didn't make a sound. It didn't give off light or heat. It just was. And it was hungry. The sheriff stared into it, his face frozen in a mask of ultimate terror. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air itself was being unmade between them. He fired his shotgun, and the buckshot simply vanished, swallowed by the silence. The preacher saw it and fell to his knees, babbling prayers that were devoured before they could reach his lips. The townsfolk screamed and broke, fleeing in every direction, their torches dropping to the ground as they scrambled over each other to escape the quiet, patient horror. The void expanded slowly, deliberately. It touched the tip of the sheriff's shotgun, and the metal dissolved like sugar in water. It touched his hands, and they faded into translucence. It touched his face, and his terrified expression was wiped away from existence. In seconds, he was gone. And the void, its hunger sated, simply winked out, leaving nothing behind. The clearing was silent again, littered with dropped torches that hissed and sputtered on the damp ground. Silas looked from the empty space where the sheriff had been to Clara and the child. Sarah was asleep again, her face peaceful. Clara stood tall, the tears gone, her expression one of solemn, terrible victory. The town of Broken Trace had finally been forced to look in the mirror, and the mirror had shown it a monster of its own making. Dawn broke over a landscape of ashes and fear. The few torches that hadn't burned out smoked in the gray light, sad monuments to the night's terror. The town of Broken Trace was silent, but it was a new kind of silence. Not the silence of judgment, but the silence of a tomb. Clara, Silas, and Sarah walked out of the woods as the first rays of sun touched the tops of the red cliffs. They didn't look back. There was nothing left for them there. They packed what little they had, a spare blanket, a tin of coffee, the hammer and the nails that had been a down payment on a life they would never live here. Before they left the cabin for the last time, Clara walked to a small, gnarled oak tree at the edge of the property. She took the locket from around her neck. It was cool now and silent, just a piece of wood. She dug a small hole in the dark earth with her bare hands and placed the locket inside. No words, no ceremony, just the quiet return of a secret to the ground that had kept it for so long. They walked away from the cabin, away from Widow's Spine, away from the town of Broken Trace. They didn't know where they were going. They were just three survivors, a found family walking east, toward the rising sun. Clara walked with her head held high, her limp no longer a sign of weakness, but a testament to her strength. Silas walked beside her, no longer a man hunting a ghost, but a man who had found a purpose. And between them, holding both their hands, was Sarah. She was quiet, but her eyes were bright with the promise of a future where she would never have to be afraid again. They were never a curse. They were the reckoning. They were the ones who didn't break. They were the ones who rewrote the story. The silence wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The world is full of silent places and forgotten stories, each with a truth waiting to be uncovered. The story of Clara and Silas is just one of them. What happened to them next, where the trail took them, is a story for another time. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of hidden truths and unexpected justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know what secrets are waiting in the silence.